Marriage and divorce. The divorce stuff, I don't know. That's certainly less fun. The marriage stuff and the partnering and all that is, I think, one of the more fun topics. And I hope we can inject some fun along the way into all of this because most of us are in, if you like, a partnership market of some kind. Some people, of course, have different either never partnered or never married over time. That's a fairly small share of people, but some people do that. And of course, some people are polyamorous, and so you might think about multiple partners, but that also is fairly uncommon. And so most of us are in, if you like, the marriage market at some point in our lives, whether it's marriage or partnership or what have you. And of course, it could be with opposite sex or same sex or whatever. And that is, of course, changing quite a bit. So we'll have a little bit to say about things that are salient. Okay, so here I'm seeing another person in the wait room, and let me admit them. I apologize for getting distracted with that. I'll have to think about examining the waiting room. Okay. All right. So Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers are people whom I know, and I think Justin might know sort of who I am. I met him once or twice. They have a ton of Twitter followers, and Betsy is a fantastically smart person who used to work in government. Justin is another fantastically smart person who I think has probably never actually worked in government. Oops, I'm sorry. So let me just back up here. Okay, and I wanted to include some tweets from them. And so if you're not on Twitter, there's no particular reason to subject yourself to the boiling cauldron of sadness or anger that usually persists there. But there's a lot of good things on Twitter, and two of them anyway are Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. And so here is a slide showing her tweets from earlier today about the unemployment insurance claims. And so they more than doubled. Well, 3.2, I think was what the previous number was. And she's saying in her second tweet here is that they basically doubled. So that's pretty impressive. And also, Betsy's pointing out in her third tweet that the rise in the unemployment insurance claims reflects the period before the CARES Act, which extends unemployment insurance to the 1099 or gig workers, the people like Uber drivers, et cetera, who probably these days, I would imagine, are engaged in delivering Whole Foods groceries or something like that. Okay, great. Oops, sorry. So that was Betsy, and then I just wanted to point out that, I'm sorry, bungling my navigation here, that like most Twitter users, she also is a human and not just an economist. Sometimes economists seems like a bit like robots. How is it then that that I have nowhere to go, and yet the hours in my day seem to slip away faster? She posts last night, which I thought was just perfect. This just happens to be her feed. And then the previous tweet before that was great because a sweet compliment with only a little dig at economists generally from a now dear friend that I met because she was a student in the very first principles of econ class that she ever taught. So she and Justin are both committed economics teachers as well as public personalities and serious economists. But I just thought that was great because economists take, I think rightfully so, a lot of digs from a lot of people. And you might say, just looking at the slides from today, we've given you a bunch of ammunition about why one should take digs at economists for things like, the economics of marriage markets and things like that, for sure. Okay, I'm sorry, let me just take a second, admit more people. I'm also going to try to make sure that I see that we are recording here. Okay, good, we are recording. That was one of the most important things to get that correct. Okay, so here's Justin's tweets around about the same time. They are married. If that wasn't obvious, I probably should have mentioned that before. So he points out that this is a monstrous 6.65 million claims. And the week before was revised up, and so it's very, very close to a doubling, I guess a little tiny bit more than that. And it's completely unprecedented. Now, the other thing that one can say, of course, is that, we wanted it this way. This is a remarkable increase in unemployment claims. If you do the arithmetic, it turns out that probably this means that the unemployment rate currently in the United States is like 10%, which is a huge increase. Now, having having said that, 10% is very high. It's also roughly where we were during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. So this graph is showing you the unemployment insurance claims per week, which is different than the unemployment rate, which is a snapshot that's measured every month. We're going to see the unemployment rate for March come out, I believe, tomorrow. The first Friday of each month usually reports on the previous month's unemployment, which is an average over the month. And so it's not going to be 10%, but in a month from now, as we are preparing for our final exam, we might well see the numbers for April, and it might well be 10%, which is going to be high. Now, in a way, this is good. This is what you want during a contagion. You want people not working. Now, obviously, the problem is that if you're not working, you're not earning typically. But the CARES Act did increase unemployment insurance benefits. So, and if you are in the pool of unemployed, my heart goes out to you, and my thanks go out to you also, because being unemployed, staying at home is part of what this is all about right now, unfortunately. Okay, hopefully I won't spill my tea. So having said that about the econ side, let's just take a quick look at this, which I am so grateful to my partner for pointing this out. So she is in the administrative side of healthcare and has been looking at this, which is a website put up by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, IHME, up at the University of Washington. And I thought if I could get this to work correctly with my screen share, we would take a quick look at this. You can click this or type it into a browser if you like. And it shows you this whole point about flattening the curve. What is interesting is that you can compare neighboring states like California, Oregon, and Washington. Washington State was the first one hard hit by the COVID-19 epidemic and mortality. Whoops, sorry, that came out of that. Sorry, I'm just seeing notifications and I'm okay. I must not be looking at the right part of Slack. Yeah, okay, maybe you guys are just discussing this offline. I'm sorry, I'm talking with the GSIs for a second here, but I feel like I am all thumbs often with this. Let me also just check the chat room quickly. Okay, if I want to make one of you co-hosts, you can manage the waiting room. Well, that's a great idea. Let me see if I can. It's okay, Leslie, to use Slack. It's great. I just didn't really understand whether I was doing it right or wrong. I think we'll just stand pat. I think students who have arrived, and I'll see little dials and dingers, I guess, that'll pop up. So I apologize to everybody else for my being distracted here, and thanks for coming along for the ride. So I think everything is fine. And my concern is, in case, I guess people use the raise your hand function if they need to stop me for some really, like, I don't know, if I if my hair all falls out and I don't notice it or something like that, that would be a reason, I think, to stop me and say, well, why don't you wear a hat, perhaps? Okay, let's have a look then at this website. If I can slide over here to this, and I'm hoping that this is going to be visible. So here is let me just reload the full thing, and I'm hoping that my screen is still showing up for everybody. And this is the story for the United States. I wonder if I zoom in a little bit, if that will make the type a bit larger for you. You can, of course, do this in a separate window, and I've managed to give you a commercial to look at something else that might be very distracting. But if you would like to do this offline, maybe afterwards, so to speak, that might be the way to go. So here's the story about the United States as a whole with the peak resource use, and it comes out of a forecast like this. So there's a curve, and the curve, of course, reflects the progress of this pandemic. It differs a lot by state, and so one thing that's useful here is to click in this box and look, say, at California. So for the nation as a whole, the peak resource use is forecast to be April 15th. That's a pretty good day to be at home, safe. If we look at California, it turns out that we have flattened the curve a bit more. So the peak resource use is forecast to be April 22nd. So let me just pull in a couple of, here's one person in the waiting room, okay. So there's California. You might also be interested in Washington State. Let me pull that up. And so here is April 11th, an earlier date than California.
Ryan, I think people is not watching your screen with the website.
Thank you. Thank you. Folks aren't watching my screen. Let me try to share my screen again. I apologize for that. How about that? Is that, folks see that?
Yeah, that's okay.
Thanks very much. So I think I have to stop sharing and then click back over and share again, which is what I just did. Okay, so let me keep talking, narrating here. So Washington State looks like this. April 11th is the peak. California is later because we are doing and have been able to do a better job flattening the curve. So here's April 26th in California. So for all of you fellow Californians, thank you from all of us. For everybody else living in other states, thank you also. And for those of you who may be abroad and joining us from abroad, I gather the time difference is probably impacting you a lot more than of course it's impacting us, because many of us are still able to be here in Pacific time. Here is where my brother and his family live, and it's a very scary story. April 9th, they have not been able to flatten the curve, as is said. So if this is helpful to you, if you live in a different state, I know for me, my aging parents are 70, turning 77, and they're 78. And so I like to look at Minnesota, and there the peak is coming. How to operationalize this? This is a good time not to get injured, because this is, if the forecast is correct, this is the time when hospitals will be most impacted by coronavirus admissions. So you can look at, depending where you are, what state you're living in, you can use this website to assess that and try to figure out the best times not to be out, not to be, you know, mountain biking. What's another risky sport? Bungee jumping, if people do that anymore. Okay, so let me stop the share and bring us back to our slides here. Thank you for pointing out my, I managed to bungle that. I apologize for that. And I'm hoping folks can see this slide again. The IHME, good, okay. Thanks. I think is that Felipe who's talking?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can't, I wonder how you managed to unmute yourself, but I'm very happy that you did. Every day brings a new moment when I think I'm really a Zoom rookie. You know, let me just take a step and back here and also say, so with the Zoom bombing that we've become aware of, let me just prepare everybody for the possibility that we might have to end the meeting if we get Zoom bombed. Now, I don't think I posted the link to this Zoom meeting anywhere publicly. So if any Zoom bombing happens, and if any of you have experience with that, feel free to raise your hand or share about your experience in the chat. I think it's rather unpleasant. Zoom bombing usually gets run, I would imagine, by young, probably male folks who are not employed and are sitting at home. And I mean, if they're restaurant employees, my hat's off to them. I wish they wouldn't Zoom bomb people, but what can happen is they can show up into a public Zoom meeting and create some real havoc and really, do some pretty not things that are very conducive to good society. Let's put it that way. So if we get Zoom bombed, I'll do what I can, and we might just have to end the meeting and start it again or something like that. And don't feel free, if it traumatizes you, just to bow out altogether. That's okay too. I can tell by the blinking red light that we are recording this successfully, and it seems to have been working pretty well recently. So I'm happy with that moving ahead. Let me just quickly check the chat. Okay, yeah, so a password suggestion is one of the things that is suggested here for Zoom bombing. And I think we could do that. I mean, if the link is not public and it's only in B courses, then it's going to have to be an inside job anyway. So if there's a password, that just is a second step that an inside job person would have to take up. So I'm not really sure that helps much, but maybe I'm wrong. And certainly I appreciate the suggestions. Some people lost their connections and need to be readmitted into the meeting. Yes, thanks. Thank you for that note. I can see what I think I need to do. Okay, so there's one person I see in the waiting room is to delegate this. Once I figure out how to do that, just figuring out how in the world to pull up, for example, one of the GSIs. Oh, here we go. Maybe if I pull up Katerina and I try to do make co-host, and I'll try that and see if that works. And I'll do that for Leslie too, just for kicks. Okay. Make co-host, and I'll stop there, even though all of our GSIs are all co-equals and should be co-hosts, but I think I'd rather move ahead rather than take too much more time. All right, so let's get down to business finally. I apologize for the delay. I just, I know some students probably would prefer me to get to the punchline more quickly, and I guess I just can't help but to try to make these topics more real, tying us into where we are today. And of course, where in some extent what we're thinking about is the effects on unions and fertility, maybe of being locked up with each other, if in fact you are. Of course, the other big problem is that if you're not cohabitating at this point, you're not locked up together. And you would imagine, if anything, that might drive you further apart and make the union, it might make it more fragile. We don't know. This is a tender time. And I guess the upside of it is that if these topics are interesting to you, there's going to be a lot of potential for writing interesting papers, term papers, master's theses, your undergraduate thesis. If you're going to stick with us for another year, if you're on your way out, you might be headed to a job or to graduate school. And of course, there might also be a big question mark facing you because of the very unique times that we are in right now. At least, taking these topics, which can sometimes seem either esoteric or completely antiquated, as we'll see today, and thinking about the implications for our lives today is, at least for me, a form of escapism. Obviously, watching television is usually a better version of that, or for, if you actually have the time for it, I like to play video games too. Okay, so we're going to talk about Gary Becker and an antiquated but still useful, arguably in some ways, theory of gains to marriage. And I think you'll see as we go through the slides, the data are one thing. The theoretical gains to marriage is a dinosaur theory. It is. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any usefulness, but certainly for the usefulness for today's United States is a bit questionable. Whether it's useful in other countries is also a question, because different countries have very different traditions and norms and levels of development. But, it's not out of the box a uniform theory, but at least it gets us thinking about some of the things that we think are important. We'll talk about divorce, and hopefully we'll inject some modernity along the way, if possible. Let me check the participants. I think we're all set with everybody. All right. So why marry versus why not marry? And this is an interesting juxtaposition, because here we're opening the question of whether or not you marry. And also, I wish I had written the word when marry. That's a big question these days too. You could also, I guess, add the word how. How do you marry? Do you cohabitate? Do you just date sequentially, and that's it? So I'm going to I think that's a waiting list, and I bet Katerina or Leslie was able to get to that. So contrast the why marry with the Malthusian approach, which just assumes that everybody does marry provided that they have enough money. So underneath it all, in the Malthusian model, the reason the birth rate rises with the wage is that you are able to marry. Then, of course, marriage is sort of a one-time thing. Even in Malthus's time, he wasn't imagining higher earnings bringing you in more marriages. He was imagining higher earnings bringing you in more children, which is empirically often the case, with a positive income effect sort of muscling through and getting you to choose more children, especially in a traditional society. So we're opening things up a little bit more, but again, the Becker model is still pretty primitive. It just says, well, maybe we could think about the choices to marry and what actually determines it, rather than being it's just income and that's it. okay, living together, marrying, what's the difference between those? And I think that there's more to be said, more to be drawn out of this great paper by Stevenson and Wolfers that's on the reading list. And of course, it's already 13 years old, so it too is a bit out of date. But I think it addresses this, and I believe we've got a slide to discuss this cohabitation thing, which of course is most likely what you all are thinking about at this stage in your lives, which is earlier, and usually, you know, marriage comes along quite a bit later, especially for the college educated. Then we'll talk about the metaphor here, similarity or difference between marriage and forming a firm or some kind of a corporate relationship. And, you know, so there we've opened up ourselves as economists to being ridiculed by people who realize that, of course, marriage is not a corporation or a firm. It's true. You could think about it, though, you know, suppose the rigid legal structures of a corporation are not so totally different from like a prenup. A prenuptial agreement is something that has grown in popularity, especially among the wealthy. A lot of us don't have them. I don't have them with my partner, for example, and I don't know of anybody who does, but wealthy people typically have prenups. And of course, we know that from, you know, watching the carnage after the celebrity divorces and things like that. What are we trying to explain? Here's one view of it, which is showing across time, so that's the x-axis here, the different shares of adults 18 or older who are in these different categories, either never married, divorced or separated, widowed, and married here at the bottom. So the green shaded area has been declining. Now, of course, a bunch of things are happening underneath all this. One of them is changing age structure. The population is aging. So if you started in 1960, it's a much younger population than the United States has today. Probably the most recent might be 2014 or something here in this graph. That's part of it. But another big part is the trend toward divorce. So you can get married and then get divorced. And you can also be never married. And so this is going to reflect some people who make it through all, if you will, all the way through life without ever marrying. Maybe that's an accomplishment, maybe it's not, I don't know. But there are people who never marry. And then of course, there are people who just haven't married yet. That's the point of the second set of slides here. You might ask, is marriage really on the decline? Well, here is the snapshot of being married, say by age 25, which is a decent way of measuring it. And this is a pretty significantly downward trend, right? This is kind of edging lower and lower and lower. Now, age 25 is age 25, but you know, you're usually past college at that point, usually well into your job, unless of course there's been a pandemic and you can't get a job or something horrible like that. I don't mean to make light of it, but I think it's important to joke about it sometimes. So a declining rate of ever married, okay, but it could be that you're delaying it. Here then is what the data look like if you examine it by age 50. And of course, in a particular year, the age 25-year-olds are not even included in this upper category because they're not age 50 at that point, right? So sure, there could be cohort effects here that are sort of bedeviling things a bit, but the flatness of this line up here at the top suggests that, you know, we've seen a small reduction in ever married. So in other words, the 100 minus whatever this number is, which looks like it's about 90% ever married here in about 2014 or so. So about 10 percentage points then of people were never married by age 50. And of course, you know, so I'm 46, and I can tell you that if it were the case I were not married by now, I would not close the book on it. You're most likely going to live into your 80s, even with the coronavirus, which typically claims people in their 80s or 70s, and sometimes younger people as well. But there's a lot of life left to live, and so even age 50 doesn't really tell you for sure what's going to happen. And so if you condition on a later age, you'll see more marriage. It's not obvious that there's really some crisis of marriage. Here then is what happens if you look at birth cohorts. And so the reason the black series here ends in what is this, about 1970 or so, is that we don't know for the birth cohort of 1970 what things look like at age 50, not until this year. So classic problem in demography, that if you look at the cohort measures, it will tell you something that's more deeply meaningful about people's life experiences. But the problem is that you won't know about them until maybe they're dead, or past, fertility ages, or past marital ages, or whatever it is. John Mulaney, the comedian, has some new show where he's with kids and they're singing children's songs, but it's mostly rated G. And so one of the songs that they came up with is Grandma Has a Boyfriend. And so Grandma's like in the nursing home and she has a boyfriend, and they might get married, right? Marriage happens throughout the life cycle. It's not only something that happens when you're young. And of course, then it raises the point about older and many older marriages. Like, okay, so there's a life, you can think of the demography of marriages, right? Some of them die very soon. Some of them live for a very long time. And of course, unlike death, you actually can come back from divorce or from widowhood. You can marry somebody else. And so you can have many, many marriages over a lifetime if you feel like it, like somebody like Geraldo Rivera does or something. Geraldo, if you don't know who that is, you probably don't want to Google Geraldo Rivera, because I don't think you like what you'd find. But Geraldo famously has been married like 10 times or something. And somebody could probably answer that question for me in the chat if they feel like it. This graph kind of gets at that. There then is this trend, as one gets older in a particular birth cohort. So these are actually roughly my parents in this birth cohort, the 1940 through 1945. It's also, the tough thing is that this is the birth cohort, and older people, if they're still alive and with us, this is the birth cohort that is going to be heavily impacted by COVID-19, tragically. And their time with us on average will be shortened because of this outbreak. So what we can see here is that there's a never married chunk of this group, but it was, very large at age 15. Thank goodness. I don't know who was married at age 15, but apparently some were. And then it kind of fell off a cliff. It's not it's not the point of the graph here, but it's behind this box, the legend. The first marriage really opens up a ton. And then of course, people start to have left their first marriages through divorce. The remarried on their second marriage. I'm trying to think about how to exactly think about these two different groups. When we obviously never married is sort of clear. On your first marriage is rather clear too. My parents are still on their first marriage. And they're part of a decently sized chunk of these folks. So here's about a 60% level or so at these older, age 55, I guess, minus about, say, 5 percentage points or maybe 10. So, you could say roughly half of this birth cohort stayed in their first marriage. And of course, one of the questions is what happens when widowhood happens. And they might be taken out of this measure. That would be my guess, because if somebody's dead, that's certainly, you're not going to count them here in the age. So changing, right? Over the life cycle, you might get married, you might decide that marriage is not for you. And this is an important statistic and trend. But until you kind of dig into it, I think an economist would say, look, you don't know exactly what the situation was in a particular marriage. People marry presumably for reasons, and it could be love and partnership, and it could be economics, and there are a bunch of things. And it could also be tradition, and it could be norms, and it could be religion, and it could be many things. Many of those things, of course, change over the life cycle, and that's what you end up seeing. So previously married twice. The last thing I'll say here is that the very top group, that would be the Geraldo Rivera's up there, the greater than twice previously married, and I think he's probably in his 60s. It's not a particularly large share of people, but it does happen. Geraldo. Okay. Excuse me. So here's a snapshot of how you could measure the changes over time here. If you looked at the far left-hand side of this table, what you'll see are the differences between the birth cohorts born between 40 and 45, which is my parents. And then the oldest baby boomers are usually assigned to something like this, 1950 to 55. So you could extend it back to 1945 if you like, but the point is it's 5 years worth of birth cohorts spaced 10 years apart. Percent ever married at age 45 then was a bit different. So, this is somewhat on the increase, never marrying. And of course, it doesn't mean you're never partnered. It means that you're never married. So you can still have romantic relationships. It's just that, the state of having ever been married was falling, measured in this way between these birth cohorts. Here's a big part of the story. The average age at first marriage between these two birth cohorts rose by a full year. So that's part of the story. Let me, I guess, finish the first two columns. You could also jump over and talk about within a particular birth cohort, what does it look like across gender, race, and education? That's what the other side of the panel is all about. The other, yeah, so this is kind of an interesting thing too. So my parents then are part of this 64.5% still in first marriage. You will see this if you talk to either one of these two groups, the baby boomers or the war babies. We'll talk about this, that they had a bit of a different approach to staying in marriage, reflected by an almost 10%, 10 percentage points difference between these two groups and the share of who was still in their first marriage. So if you like, the stock market idiom is fire and forget, right? Or something like that. You fire your rocket up at the stock market and you choose your portfolio and you forget and you just let it just grow with the stock market over time. And you could also think about that as choosing a spouse. You just sort of choose the best that you can at the time, and you just sit back and let your life take over and do and the other person's life take over and do what you will with it, rather than trying to optimize. And the baby boomers were much more about optimizing and maybe undoing marriages that weren't working for them. So that's also shown here, about a 7 percentage point increase in the percent of first marriage is ending in divorce. And so there are a ton of statistics to talk about here, and I think Stevenson and Wolfers do a better job of it. Let me just say a few things. There are big differences between men and women. I don't have a lot to say about that, but black and white, you can see big differences. And then college grads and less than college, well, that's the remarkable thing. At least among these birth cohorts, you didn't see a big difference there, but you did see a big difference here in the average age at first marriage. And that is, that's kind of the deal, right? Part of it's mechanical, that if you're going to college, it's harder to be married at the same time, and that's going to just mechanically push it up the average age of marriage. But part of it also is, what do you do with a college degree? Well, you could go to college to meet a spouse. That's not totally unheard of. Effectively, that's what my partner and I actually did, and many of my friends did too. But you go to college to raise your earnings. So you might postpone marriage, your first marriage, that's what this row is about, to get established, to go get a job. I guess boy, it's going to be so interesting to see what happens to marriage rates after this, what could be a very temporary recession. And of course, the other question, we've talked about what happened to fertility during the Great Recession of 2008 to 2009, but the other question that's interesting is what happened to marriage rates. I suspect they didn't increase. We'll see. Okay, well, there's a ton to talk about here, and that's kind of the story with the Stevenson and Wolfers piece, which I hope you enjoyed reading, and you can go back and reference it. There's a lot of things to discuss, and I think I'd like to just move ahead, especially given the time. So here's a handy table discussing what your parents may be yelling at you about, if your parents are like mine. The thing is that your parents, of course, are much younger than my parents, and so they might not have a big issue with this about cohabitation. So one of the things you might wonder about, is it really true that if you cohabit, that's either a path to marriage, or is it a substitute for marriage, and you'll never end up marrying because the idiom is why buy the cow if you can get the milk for free. Buying the cow then is the metaphor for actually marrying, and then getting the milk of the cow for free is getting the benefits of the marriage per se, without actually getting married, without actually signing a marriage certificate and having a wedding. And of course, you don't have to have a wedding, you can just elope. So what this is trying to show is that you can track this sort of thing about over time. Unmarried couples who then talked about what they viewed their partnership as being. So whether it was a substitute for marriage, or a precursor, or a trial marriage, or co-residential dating, and then what happened over time. So everybody who was cohabitating then So 20, about a fifth of them, 20%, 21%, then were still living together. So in other words, 5 to 7 years later, there was no progression, if you like. It was just the same. And maybe they intended it to be that way. And in fact, the first row shows you the 39% of people who probably thought of it that way, that, well, we're not going to get married. We're going to live together, and that's our deal. 40% then, going up to the first row again, ended up being married, and another 40% ended up being separated. So it's not as if living together, monotonically sends you in one direction or another. There are some who just end up in that position after a while, but it does appear that part of what determines what happens is your characterization of it. So those who said it was a precursor to marriage, about half then ended up marrying later. Now, if it's a precursor, why are you in the precursor? Well, you want to make sure it's going to work for you. And so for some people it didn't. And so the 31%, they've decided, no, we learned that this is not for us. 17% presumably are like, either they've changed their view of it, or they still need more time after 5 to 7 years, and some people are like that. So I think what you could say, if you have an older relative who is yelling at you because you're co-residing, you're cohabitating with your partner, or you're thinking about it and they're telling you not to do it because it's a one-way trip into sadness, is to say, the picture is a complicated one. There's a lot of heterogeneity, and there's, I think, good evidence that what people are doing with this is they're partnering with an eye toward understanding whether they actually want to be married to somebody. Why would you do that? Well, the other thing, and we'll talk about this more at the end of 175, but we've seen it somewhat already. A lot of people might optimally think about whether you want to marry person X versus person Y versus weight, because we're living so much longer. And you could view it that way, that, with life expectancy for your birth cohorts, probably around, given to age 20, it might be something like 85. That's a long time to be married to somebody. And of course, that's a magical thing. So my parents are celebrating their 53rd wedding anniversary this year. And it's great. They love it. But some people find that the match isn't perfect, and the longer you're on earth, the longer you have to feel sad about something too. It's not obvious whether marriage takes you upward or downward, and it's never always obvious in advance. So this is, I guess, the point, that people plan. That's what economists love talking about, is the planning, the forming of expectations, and then of course, prices also matter a ton. Here are some statistics that show you the deal with marriage across different industrialized countries. I wish here we had a country like Japan. I don't think we have them here. We've got Italy and Sweden, so it's all Europe basically. And so that's going to give you a particular view of things that is not quite the same as if you were to, say, look at Japan or India or China. And I think you'd see very different stories there. So my punchline in the point at the bottom is just that there's a lot of churn in the marriage market in the United States, just like in the labor market there is traditionally. A lot of people become unemployed in the U.S. It typically is people in low-skilled services and also in construction who become unemployed a lot, and then they become re-employed during usual times. Also in the United States, there are a lot of divorces, and there are also a lot of marriages. And so that's one way of viewing it, that maybe the marriage markets in the United States, the US is so much larger geographically too, but it also has a much bigger mixing of people than most of these other countries. Canada is another place with a fairly decently sized share of the population who are foreign born. But the United States really leads all of these places in terms of that heterogeneity. And if you recall, we talked a little bit some sessions ago about St. Patrick's Day and Irish identity in the United States. And one of the reasons why there are so many Americans who view themselves as being Irish American is because it turned out that the marriage markets for Irish were great. About half of the people were Catholic, meaning that they could easily find co-religion matches because they didn't have something like 90-10 split, which would, you know, if religion is important for you, that means that you don't really have the full breadth of groups available. So on average, it was a fairly heterogeneous group, access to a lot of marriage markets. And that's kind of the story. I guess another way in which you could say America is great, I suppose, you know, I don't mean to beat the drum, but a healthy operating marriage and divorce market means that people are able to start something and stop something if they want to. And there's a great message in sort of the freedom of all that. Okay, so economists like to believe that people do things that are in their own best interests. And of course, sociologists would point out that people often don't do those things and are doing things that they may have to or are expected to do. And that's a very good point also. So what we're going to do for a lot of this class, talking about Becker's model, is to try to abstract from all the reality that we know surrounds the choice to marry and families and all that. And, you know, let's face it, families play a very big role in all this, but, you know, it's still malleable. You know, if you ever watched Downton Abbey on PBS, which had a movie, I think, come out in the fall, you know, the role of family and marriage was huge then. It was a period of time around the First World War. And then actually the Spanish flu epidemic was covered in that show in Downton Abbey, and several of the prime working age people died in the show from the Spanish flu. And family was really important, but at the same time, even as Granny would point out, family wasn't supremely important, that love and partnership was still, you know, the thing that you kind of needed to have. And if you didn't have that, then family maybe could fill up the gap. But if you had it and family wasn't in favor of it, maybe it might be best to still move ahead with it. And then the other, you know, sort of coattail or funny connection there is how one of the characters was Irish, involved in at the time, maybe not it was not a war of revolution, but certainly you could liken it to that when the Republic of Ireland gained its independence after the First World War. And so this was this big kerfuffle in this family. It was a British aristocracy, and one of the daughters goes and marries somebody from Ireland who's an Irish Republican, very different. So all those things, that was a very lengthy digression, but all those things are important for marriage, clearly. Economists like to focus on the gains to marriage and understanding what they might be. And you could think about this as really being much more salient in earlier periods when extended families had much more control over marriage. Still, especially in understanding the trends and things today and the different characteristics, you know, going back to the breakdown by college and non-college attendees, and I wish they had done it by high school. There are big differences in the rates of marriage between these different educational classes in the United States, big differences across the income distribution, and understanding those differences. To be honest, I think it's actually the frontier, but it's something that you, for example, could contribute to if this is interesting to you. This is all very salient, and having an economic perspective on it at least gets you talking about things that probably are important. So Gary Becker's totally outdated theory of gains to marriage, which is still useful to think about. It's not obvious that it's particularly salient today. It looks a lot like international trade theory. And so I've got a slide coming up that shows you a graph that looks like that. If you've taken international trade, you probably have a better and more refined sense of these models. What we're going to talk about are the broad principles that you can apply. Comparative advantage is a big one. And what comparative advantage tells you is that two countries usually, but you can also abstract and say, well, two entities, and they could be a husband and a wife, or two husbands, or two wives, or what have you, could gain from trading by specializing in what they do best in the dyad. So it's the same story with China and manufacturing, which is done much more efficiently in just about every way. I'm sure that's not completely true, that there probably are some industries in which China does not have the comparative advantage. And of course, other countries are all players of this as well. But you could think of this in broad terms, that the United States increasingly specializes in things like financial services and less industrial versions of GDP activity than, say, China does. And it's because China has the comparative advantage in it. And it's best, it improves outcomes for both countries if China specializes in industrial production, the United States specializes in something like financial product innovation. As I'm saying that, I'm laughing about, of course, what happened in 2008, where the financial products that were innovated were kind of led to a downfall. So yeah, one can always come away with anecdotes about ways in which this doesn't work. So the ideology in what Becker's writing about sounds a lot like the 1950s, and it doesn't seem like it obviously applies today. But the other points to say here are that broad concepts in economics, economies of scale, of public goods that are shared within a household, are very salient with the economics of marriage and the household. The other things are having own children, own biological children, which is probably cheaper than adopting or doing other things. We'll talk about that a little bit more. There might be substitutes to having children, and those might be cheaper substitutes, but they might not be, they might be imperfect substitutes as well. There's another concept here too that we'll talk about at the bottom, the point about marriage-specific capital. And that sounds complicated. So capital in the Solow model was a specific thing, physical objects that produce other objects, like offices, like construction equipment. Capital also generally means things that is productive. And you can think about social capital, political capital. These are usually things like trust, the sense of owing somebody something, a reputation. Marriage-specific capital could be thought of like that, and also of other types of habits or working relationships that make you more productive. For example, spousal extrasensory perception, or ESP. Understanding what your spouse is likely to want or need you to do in advance. And that can happen. It's how? Well, you've seen the patterns of behavior. And so you can kind of jump to the end and the finish line and provide whatever it is. Maybe it's picking up the kids. Maybe it's preparing the meal, even though you haven't talked about who's going to do it. Maybe you have this sense that they ought to be doing it. So it's that kind of thing. And of course, that can happen in non-marital relationships too. It can happen with roommates. It's just that the thing about a marriage is it usually is a little bit more long-term, and thus with a long-term investment horizon, you have a greater incentive to actually invest in marriage-specific capital. Investing in learning, I think, is really what we're talking about here. It's not a physical object that is useful in marriage, you know. It's the learning, it's the understanding and the expectations that could be very useful in conducting your life. Okay, so in the economies of scale side of things here, everything on this page, it holds also for roommate relationships, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, that it's hard to live on your own, even though there are things that are preferable about it. But if you have to clean your room, you might do better if you had somebody else to rely on, so that that person could clean your room every other week or something, and you could switch, or you could specialize. And of course, we're not getting into that, but the economies of scale argument here is just that if you have a vacuum, first of all, that's a fixed cost to buy a vacuum. And then secondly, if you start it and then vacuum 2 rooms, it's a lot easier than starting the vacuum and vacuuming a room, stopping. The other person comes in, starts the vacuum, vacuums their room. It's, there's a lot of starting and stopping, which kind of wastes time. And this is also true for cooking. If you cook, I'm sure you know this, right? If me with 3 people, it's a lot easier. And if I didn't have my partner around, I would never cook. It just wouldn't make any sense. But the fact that she is around with our 2 children means that cooking is a really good deal, because other things are just less effective. There are economies of scale in food production. So that's true also for space and in things like household durable goods like refrigerators and televisions and things like that. Public goods are things that one person consuming doesn't leave any less of for other people. A clean house, a nice view of the Golden Gate Bridge are examples of these sorts of things. And so the argument would be that these are more affordable with the combined resources of two people possibly benefiting from their the economies of scale, and then you can purchase these sorts of things. So that's another argument. Children, and so here's where things start to get a little bit out of date, I would say. Biological children are, of course, a product of male-female contributions, but you can also obtain them outside of a partnership. This was less true back when Becker was writing, where scientific options weren't really as developed. It always was possible, of course, to adopt, but adoption markets, I think, grew a lot. You know, it's not easy, right? It's much easier to just obtain it if you could do it the old-fashioned way. These days, though, that this isn't quite as true. And I guess the other thing, which I don't think is well understood, is to what extent children are substitutes for and by pets and other types of things. Maybe other people's children are substitutes for your own children. You know, if you have nieces and nephews, for example, they're kind of a lot like your kids. And one of the best parts about that, of course, is that you get to go home and they'll go to their home and you don't have to take care of them overnight. So I think some people would say that that's kind of a clear omission here, and it's true, but yeah, what to say? You know, the other thing is, like, do you know you want to have children? And a lot of times that just develops over the life cycle. One of the things I've been meaning to do and just ran out of time, I know we surveyed the class back in the long ago of our in-person class visits about fertility intentions. And so I'll try to have a look at that again before next Tuesday and see what the story was on those eye clickers, those old strange physical devices that we used back before we all became computer screens. Okay, so here's this totally outdated perspective that's fun to read because of just how outrageously old it seems. The obvious explanation for marriages between men and women is in the desire to raise own children and the physical and emotional attraction between sexes. Nothing distinguishes married households more from single households or from those with several members of the same sex than the presence, even indirectly, of children. Sexual gratification, cleaning, feeding, and other services can be purchased. That's just a fantastic phrase there, because it's true. It may not always be legal to do that, but you can purchase most of those things. And of course, it varies country to country and even state to state. But generally, you cannot purchase own children, and that's kind of mostly true, especially if you are a male. And I think it's less true today if you are female. I think you can purchase your own child, but that was not the case as much anyway back when Becker was writing. So both the man and the woman are required to produce their own children and perhaps to raise them. And so, of course, that's the perhaps kind of tips the hat about this. And things were changing even back then, but they really started to accelerate, of course, in the years after, where the physical and emotional involvement called love is also primarily between persons of the opposite sex. And I think that's still true in an empirical sense. And what's useful there is that we'll have a look at some of these interesting topics in Lab 10, which uses American Community Survey data to assess differences between same-sex and opposite-sex partners. I should say partnerships, where you're looking at dyads in the American Community Survey. So here's a couple that's same sex, here's a couple that's opposite sex, and looking at the similarities and differences between them, which is a fascinating thing. And it used not to be the case that this was possible to do. It seems plausible, although I don't know of any research that has looked at this, although somebody probably has done it in this same-sex partnership may have looked in the past. Today, the percentage is something like 5% or so. It's on that order of magnitude, and it actually is measurable in many of the surveys that we've got today. So So Becker, he's writing for an earlier time. It's clearly out of date. And I guess the question is to figure out which of these things are so clearly out of date that we ought to just ignore them and what things are actually useful. Well, this is the fun one, just talking through it. The marriage-specific capital. Capital is worth something only with a specific firm or marriage, and if you change partners, you end up losing it all. And I think that's very plausible. And I think that the scary thing maybe is it could be true generally in your employment in future with firms. Maybe less true if you do something like you might work at Google and then find that working at Apple Computer might be similar enough, but you wouldn't have built up the relationships with your coworkers and your supervisors and those whom you supervise. You wouldn't have those anymore if you switched. So it's the same kind of thing. And I guess the punchline then, the important point is that if you have a contract to stay together, like a marriage agreement, you have this incentive to invest in this capital. And the reason that it's risky and the reason you might not invest is because the value of it might go to zero if the relationship were to evaporate. The trust, the ESP, any of that mind reading stuff doesn't matter much unless you were actually married to the person. So why not just live with roommates? You still get economies of scale and public goods. So this I think probably bedeviled Becker a bit, and it raises this point about own children. A marriage contract, of course, is a different kind of contract than a roommate contract, typically because marriage contracts, if you think about what usually goes along with the marriage, it usually, not always, accompanies a wedding, or a wedding accompanies a marriage. And a wedding is a gathering of friends and family. It doesn't have to be your friends or your family per se, but the point is they are people who matter to you in your life, and you take your vows in front of them and demonstrate how happy you are. That's why you have a wedding. So that's a contract. And usually, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe some of you do, but usually you don't have a similar sort of celebration for roommates. If you do, it might be a private celebration. I know I had a few of those back in college when I, happened to draw a particularly good dorm room or something with a friend of mine, but it's not something that we really publicized. And so you're not really investing in anything that's a public contract, whereas with marriage you are usually. You don't have to, but that's often what it is. It's an agreement in front of your. It could of course be in front of your religion to adhere to this arrangement, and that then encourages these investment behaviors that otherwise might be risky and potentially very fruitless. So there's a production side of it too, and of course here we quickly are falling into the sexist category of views of marriage, unfortunately, but I think it's absolutely true that we are. Because, when Becker was writing in the 60s, male and female roles within the household were quite specialized, in part because of stigma and sexism in the labor market, in part because women's education and earnings had not risen yet a bunch. And he was trying to make sense of it, I think. And part of it clearly is not something that one can make economic sense of. Part of it may be something, however, and it ties into this theory that we get from international trade about how one country could specialize in a particular kind of market work, somebody else could specialize in a different kind of work, and it could be home production, running a household. And I think the thing is, this may seem very foreign to all of us today. I know to some extent it feels foreign to me because both my partner and I both work in the market, and we also somehow juggle the home production, running a household. But I think most would agree that usually you don't split those 50-50. Usually one spouse does more of it. And in my household, it's actually me. Not that that's that uncommon, but it does turn out that on average, usually it's the female member of a dyad that gets stuck with the housework. And the childcare, not exclusively by any means, but that's on average what you typically see. Still, I think what we're accustomed to thinking of these days is that everybody does a little bit of everything, and to some extent that's more true than it was, I think, in the 60s. But just maybe a little bit of mirage, but it still often is one spouse that kind of specializes in something, whether it's vacuuming or taking out the trash or whatever it is. So the argument would be that if maybe there are just differences in it could be personality and how does one react to the stresses of being a short order cook, for example. That's different across different people, and it could be correlated with biological sex. It could not be. I really have no idea. I think it's correlated with personality traits myself, which could be different across different people. And so you might specialize then in comparative advantage. What's the thing that you are better at? And maybe you draw more utility from actually doing the work. But the argument here is something about productivity. And it's the same story as one will see then thinking about different countries. So in this world, you might think about broadly speaking, two different kinds of activities. So home production and market production. And you could make a variety of statements about this. It could be the case that the male is better at both home and market production than the female. It could be the case that the female is better at both than the male. If there is a difference in how good they are at one versus the other, if they're not identical people, so the male is a little bit better at one of them than the female is, then it makes sense to specialize in whatever you're better at. And that's true even if you have an absolute advantage in something. So think about maybe a high-powered female lawyer who's really good at earning in the market. And she's also really good at cooking. Like her cooking just blows her husband's cooking out of the water. So let's take a traditional male-female household, but it could of course be different. So the female lawyer is fantastic at her job, and she makes a ton more than he does. And the male perhaps is a construction worker. He's really good at it, and he can cook, but he's not great at it. So she's better at him in earning and also at cooking. But the thing is that he's much better at cooking relative to being a construction worker than she is in terms of her cooking versus her lawyering. She's much better at being a lawyer than being a cook, even though she's actually a better cook than he is. What the household ends up doing then is specializing. She'll go to work full-time being a lawyer. He'll be a full-time cook at home. Now, having just said that, so that's the theory, right? And then you might say, I don't believe that in fact would actually happen. Fair enough. What we're going to do is try to keep the model simple for now, and then think about real world differences here. So let's think about two pretty similar people, but in a traditional Beckerian sense of being a 1960s couple here. Here's a woman in a dyad who has a productivity, if she works at home, of 20, you could say dollars, some 20 comparable units, or working in the market producing 10. If the man were to work at home, he produces 10. So this is the sexist dyad here, right? And the man earns more working in the market. So they have a comparative advantage that the woman is more productive if she works at home, producing 20. The man is more productive working in the market, producing 20. Suppose they split their time 50-50, then what you get over here is half of 20 becomes 10, half of 10 becomes 5, half of this 10 becomes 5, and here's a 10 out of this half of the 20. So the total productivity is then the sum of these in the dyad, 15 and 15 units. And the question, can they do better, has an answer, and it's yes, they could. And you can eyeball it just by thinking, well, suppose we go along this diagonal here where the woman is working full-time in the home and producing 20 units rather than splitting her time half and half, and the man is working full-time in the market and producing 20 units. And so the sum then would be 40, rather than here the sum of the green and red is 30. So that's the simple model. You could view it as looking kind of like this, where suppose women are better at producing home production. So their budget constraint, or the production possibilities frontier, is flatter, meaning that they could get further out here producing more goods in the home than the men could. So here's the equivalent point, and you can kind of see it in the dashed line down here. So here's the female, or the women's production possibility frontier. Here's the males here. And the way to think about this then is if the men are able to get kind of further up the axis of market goods, they can locate the household up here where they are specializing. So the women are producing this. I'm sorry, the men are producing up here, and orange are the men and the green are the women, and the women are producing down here. And so they could get the household up to this budget constraint, producing this many household goods here. And the whole thing then looks like this income effect, right? So if the two were actually optimizing and not specializing, they'd choose some location that would clearly be on the interior. They've produced this new black budget constraint because of specializing, which gives them like a pure income effect, shifting the household further out in terms of what it can enjoy, because they've exploited the difference in the productivities of the two different members of the household. So that's kind of all there is to it. And let me pause and ask if there are questions about that. I think that's a fair game, reasonable exam question, is to discuss this comparative advantage aspect of the economics of marriage. Okay, well, we can come back to that later. It sounds like perhaps it's something that folks are familiar with, which is good. So it's a nice break from the income and substitution effects that are bound to bedevil all of us until the grave, I think. Okay, so you could talk about the terms of trade here, if you like, the price basically of these two different goods. As long as both parties benefit, that's kind of the point. We've got 10 minutes left, so let me just kind of move ahead and touch on the big points here. Again, one of the surprising things about comparative advantage is that you still benefit from specializing, even if one person actually has an absolute advantage in things. So this was one argument for why you might want to marry, even if you're actually better at everything than your spouse. You can still identify a task that your spouse is comparatively better at than you, and then that spouse specializes in that. It makes everybody's lives better off in this kind of primitive production sort of way. You could think about this in terms of the opportunity costs, and that's another way of describing, if you like, the slopes of those budget constraints. If these opportunity costs are they're also called the autarkic prices. It's again the slope of those production possibilities frontiers. If those slopes are different, then there are gains to trade, even if one party is better at both. And Becker calls these the gains to marriage. So it's kind of a one-to-one correspondence between international trade theory and Beckerian marriage theory. I mean, just stepping back, right? Do you think anybody really, views marriage as being like that? I will tell you one thing that I think is really kind of useful to remark about, and that is that, the Becker model is rather out of date, but that doesn't mean that some people don't still view it that way. And so when I visited Japan back in 2003, and things may have changed there, but one of the things that Japanese society was really struggling with was how to think about marriage in a time when females had increasingly better access to labor markets and careers and employment and enjoying life, to be honest, and being, empowered in one's career. To how to reconcile that with the traditional Japanese family, where there was a very high a high value placed on things like the taste of your own home cooking. Well, how do you get your own home cooking? You have to get somebody cooking in the home. And it reminds me of let's see now, that's the Cat in the Hat comes back when mother picked two somebodies, Sally and me, to shovel off the walk. That gives you a sense of the literature that I've been reading recently. So if you have to pick a somebody to do the home cooking, it's not me, right? It's going to be somebody else that you pick. Well, this is a problem then, because if Japanese males were big into the idea of a high value on, say, home cooking, but were not themselves willing to actually do the home cooking, then the deal that they'd offer to Japanese females in the marriage market would probably not be very palatable. It appeared to be a big challenge for young Japanese couples thinking about the path to marriage. So I'm no expert on that. That was my anecdotal observation of what was happening back around 2000. Of course, Japanese fertility has been very, very low for a while. I think marriage rates have also not been real high, as the country has struggled with the shifting culture of everything. Okay. So one might think then, of course, if you had this view, and again, the argument is, well, maybe there are portions of society that definitely does view it this way. Well, what happens then if you find more convergence in skills between males and females? What happens if there's convergence in skills between males and females, but only within particular educational strata, like only among the college educated perhaps, and not so much among people with a high school degree or less or something? What are these other implications of these various trends? Improved home technology, that's a good one I like, because we actually, does anybody else have a robot vacuum? Because I have a robot vacuum and it is awesome. If you don't have a robot vacuum, you should get a robot vacuum, because that really is great. I don't have to vacuum the house anymore. I do have to turn on the robot vacuum. That's still my job. Yeah, the Roomba. Yeah. So of course we have a a knockoff, a cheap knockoff that still works. Yeah. We have a cheap knockoff of a robot vacuum, and that thing's awesome. Okay. So in lab 10 coming up, so right now everybody's working on lab 8, which is great. Looking ahead, lab 10 is going to be fun, because in the American Community Survey, we actually can measure same-sex households. And I think the lab probably shows what the prevalence of those in California might be, which I bet it might be a little higher, but I think the national average is something like 3 or 5% or something like that. So it's not a number like 50%, and it's also not a number like 0.5%. It's something like 3 or 5, I believe. And so this will be an interesting exploration in data to examine what one might say about the differences. Next time we'll have more to say about what's called assortative mating, which gets at this issue of why you might see differences that exist. Let me actually stop there. There's some more slides to cover, but I think in 4 minutes, I don't think I can do it justice. So let me talk more about divorce next time, and let me ask if there are any questions. The chat is hilarious. I love that. Let me just be clear that if robots take over our home jobs, I am fully in favor of that. All hail the robot masters. Oh, am I just typing this to, oh no. I think I'm somehow, oh, I see, I've got to send it to everybody. I'm screwing up the chat. I'm just a goof. I'm a complete goof. Let me just because I think that's so silly. My joke is obviously so funny. Yeah, I think, I'm sorry. Now why, did that just happen again? Wow, I don't know why. So my chat is somehow sending just to Katerina, and I have no idea why that's the case. Finally, I think I fixed it. There. So I'm glad that the class is funny. Seriously, my hat is off to every single one of you. You're welcome for the banter. To enjoy this as best we can, enjoy the ride, learn something along the way. I know I'm learning a lot about Zoom. I mean, for me, and the other GSIs might be thinking about this too, and you, if you go to graduate school, might be thinking about this, that distance learning, and of course, if you don't go to graduate school, if you go into private industry, distance conferencing is kind of the way of the future. And certainly in higher education, I think, it is happening. I think some groups are pushing back against it, but it is a tremendously valuable thing to have this experience. And so I should be thanking all of you for sticking with me through all this, as I obviously am learning a ton. Were there questions about oh, here we go, domestic partnership, tax beneficial? Okay, well, yeah, so that's a really interesting point. About the tax benefits to marriage. And we didn't talk about that at all, did we? And so the question in the chat is about this domestic to be more tax beneficial than marriage. And I would have to look at what the state of this all is. Well, let me just say, in a brief thing, hopefully, that I believe Justin Wolfers and Betsy Stevenson are still not married because they viewed this financial marriage penalty in the tax code as being salient for them. That was their story about a decade ago. Whether they have gotten married since then, I'm not entirely sure. But the tax implications for being married or not married are sometimes quite real. And I'm just not a big expert about it. I mean, right? The hilarious thing is, I'm an economist. I never once thought about about the tax implications of marrying my spouse. Here's a question from Tracy about polygamous relationships. Yeah, I've never seen a discussion of the economics of polygamous relationships. Yeah, I don't have anything to say. 3D production possibilities frontier. That's true. Presumably, if everybody's different, you benefit even more from having yet another spouse. Let's just not go there. Okay. Well, I think we are reaching the end of our time. Thank you very much. With any luck, the video will have been recorded and we can talk about these topics next time. Thank you, everybody, and adios.